3 Americans are dead, not in a declared war, not in a formal campaign approved by Congress, but in a conflict that was supposed to be limited. That is how escalation begins. Quietly, then suddenly. Before we go further, if you care about clear-eyed analysis without political spin, subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep doing this work. Serious breakdowns of power, money, and global stability. Hello and welcome. I'm Alex. For years, I've studied the intersection of economics and politics. And today, we break down what's shaping our world. 3 U.S. service members killed. On the surface, it's a tragic headline, but structurally, it is something else. It is a trigger point. In American political history, casualties change everything. Not morally, that happens immediately, but strategically. Beirut in 1983, the early insurgency in Iraq after 2003. When American troops die, where the question shifts from, is this operation necessary, to what are we willing to do next? President Donald Trump built a second-term doctrine around restraint. No forever wars, precision over occupation, force without entanglement. That framework works until American blood is spilled. Once that happens, the executive branch faces a narrowing corridor of options. Escalate, and you risk widening the theater. Restrain, and you risk eroding deterrence. Iran understands this calculus. Tehran's strategic playbook is built on calibrated escalation. Inflict pain, but not enough to invite regime-ending retaliation. It uses proxies, drones, layered missile strikes, and deniable networks. The objective isn't to defeat the United States militarily. It's to shape American political will. When 3 U.S. service members are killed, the political temperature in Washington rises instantly. But here's what most headlines won't say. Escalation is not just emotional, it's structural. Once casualties occur, financial markets begin pricing in risk differently. Defense stocks move, oil futures shift, insurance premiums on shipping spike. Investors start asking whether this remains a contained exchange or evolves into regional war. Capital hates uncertainty, and uncertainty expands when American troops are dying without a clearly defined end state. There is another layer, where the war powers resolution exists precisely because democracies cannot drift into conflict through momentum alone. If military engagement expands without congressional authorization, legitimacy becomes part of the battlefield. Public trust is not a side issue, it is strategic infrastructure. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Limited wars rarely stay limited when miscalculation enters the equation. Iran may intend calibrated signaling, Washington may intend proportionate response. But the space between intention and perception is where wars widen. This moment is not just about retaliation, it is about decision architecture. Does the White House respond with overwhelming force to restore deterrence credibility? Does it absorb the strike to avoid regional expansion? Does it pursue back-channel diplomacy while publicly projecting strength? Each path carries cost. Escalation risks pulling Israel, Lebanon, and Gulf states into synchronized confrontation. Restraint risks emboldening further asymmetric strikes. Diplomacy risks appearing reactive after American deaths. Leadership in moments like this is not measured by volume. It is measured by discipline. The United States possesses unmatched military capability, but power without strategic clarity becomes a liability. 3 American lives have already altered the equation. The question now is whether Washington controls the escalation ladder, or whether the ladder begins climbing on its own. Now, history tells us this. The first casualties in a conflict rarely define its scale. The political response to those casualties does, and that response will shape not only the Middle East, but the economic stability of American families watching this unfold at home. Israel and Lebanon. The Northern Front reignites. When Israel and Lebanon begin trading strikes again, this is not a side story. This is the structural pressure point. The Northern Front is not symbolic. It is strategic. And it has always been the most dangerous theater in any Israel-Iran confrontation. Hezbollah is not just another militia. It is Iran's most advanced forward deterrent. Decades of funding, weapons transfers, training, and battlefield experience in Syria have transformed it into a hybrid force. Part insurgency, part conventional army. Its missile arsenal is not theoretical. It is embedded within southern Lebanon, layered across civilian terrain, calibrated for saturation. The strategic logic is simple. Overwhelm Israeli missile defense, create psychological shock, force Israel into costly ground operations. Israel understands this better than anyone. Its doctrine is built on preemption and escalation dominance. The message from Jerusalem is always clear. If the northern front ignites, it will be extinguished decisively. But decisive action carries systemic consequences. A full-scale Israel-Hezbollah confrontation would not resemble isolated airstrikes. It would mean weeks, potentially months, of high-intensity exchanges, urban centers under rocket fire, infrastructure degradation, mass mobilization of Israeli reservists, and inevitably civilian casualties on both sides. That is where this shifts from military calculation to geopolitical risk. Hezbollah does not operate independently. It is integrated into Iran's broader deterrence web. If Hezbollah escalates significantly, it signals Tehran's willingness to widen the battlefield without engaging directly. That creates a multi-front scenario, Israel facing pressure from Lebanon, while Iran maintains indirect leverage. For the United States, this matters in two dimensions. First, credibility. Washington's strategic relationship with Israel is not casual. It is foundational. If Israel faces sustained missile saturation, U.S. support becomes more than rhetorical. That support can take many forms. Intelligence, missile defense replenishment, naval positioning. Each step increases U.S. exposure. Second, systemic stability. The Eastern Mediterranean is not just geography, it is energy transit, shipping lanes, and capital flow. Insurance markets already price risk premiums into shipping contracts when missile exchanges increase. Energy traders watch northern Israel the way bond markets watch Federal Reserve statements, because escalation there signals potential chain reactions. History is instructive. In 2006, the Israel-Hezbollah war disrupted regional confidence but remained contained. In 1973, regional conflict triggered a global oil shock that reshaped Western economies. The difference lies in duration and intensity. The risk today is synchronization. If Israel-Lebanon violence intensifies while Iran pressures Gulf shipping routes and U.S. assets remain exposed, the conflict stops being compartmentalized. It becomes interconnected. And interconnected conflicts are harder to control. Lebanon itself is fragile, economically collapsed, politically fractured. A prolonged war would not only devastate infrastructure, it would create refugee flows, financial contagion, and expanded militia recruitment. Instability breeds opportunity for external actors. The key question is not whether Israel can absorb Hezbollah's strikes. It can. The deeper question is whether sustained northern engagement forces Israel into strategic overextension, and whether that, in turn, drags the United States further into operational commitment. Wars expand, not because leaders intend them to, but because pressure accumulates across fronts. The northern front is that pressure point, and once pressure builds beyond a certain threshold, containment becomes exponentially harder. Iran's retaliation strategy, escalate, without inviting full invasion. Iran is not reacting emotionally, it is reacting structurally. Tehran's retaliation is not designed to win a conventional war against the United States or Israel. It is designed to reshape the cost curve. That distinction matters. At the center of Iran's doctrine is survival. Regime preservation is the priority above all else. After the reported killing of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, and amid leadership transition pressures inside the Islamic Republic, the system cannot afford to appear weak, but it also cannot afford a full-scale American invasion. That creates a narrow strategic corridor, escalate just enough to restore deterrence credibility, but not enough to justify overwhelming retaliation. This is calibrated escalation in practice. Iran deploys drones because drones are ambiguous. They allow plausible deniability. They create pressure without triggering immediate regime-threatening consequences. Missile launches are measured. Targets are selected for signaling value. Military facilities, infrastructure nodes, as symbolic urban centers, but carefully short of mass casualty catastrophes that would unify Western public opinion behind a full war mandate. It is a balancing act between theater and threshold. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has spent decades building a distributed deterrence network. Hezbollah in Lebanon, militia structures in Iraq, maritime capabilities in the Gulf. Each node acts as a pressure valve. The objective is strategic diffusion. Instead of facing a single battlefield, the United States and its allies must manage multiple flashpoints simultaneously. From Tehran's perspective, fragmentation favors the weaker actor. There is also a domestic layer. During leadership transition under Article 111 of Iran's constitution, political elites must demonstrate resolve. Revolutionary regimes derive legitimacy not from economic performance alone, but from ideological defiance. Retaliation broadcasts internal strength. It signals continuity. It reassures hardline factions that the system remains intact. But every move carries risk. If Iran overplays its hand, if strikes cause mass civilian casualties in Israel, or significant American fatalities beyond the current toll, Washington's response calculus shifts sharply. Domestic political pressure in the United States would narrow tolerance for restraint. Markets would interpret it as escalation beyond containment. Coalition dynamics could solidify against Tehran. On the other hand, if Iran underresponds, it risks internal fracture. Hardliners could interpret caution as weakness. Rival power centers within the regime might exploit perceived hesitation. So Tehran walks a knife's edge. Strategically, Iran is betting on American fatigue. It assumes that President Donald Trump, having campaigned against prolonged Middle Eastern wars, will resist full escalation. It assumes that U.S. voters prioritize economic stability over regional dominance. So it assumes that markets will pressure Washington toward containment. That is a rational calculation. But rational calculations collapse when perception diverges. Brinkmanship only works when both sides share the same understanding of thresholds. If Washington interprets calibrated escalation as strategic encroachment rather than signaling, deterrence spirals. Iran's retaliation is not chaos. It is structured, layered, deliberate. But the very complexity that makes it sophisticated also makes it unstable. The more nodes involved, drones, proxies, missile exchanges, maritime threats, the more opportunities for miscalculation. History shows that wars rarely begin with declarations. They expand through misread signals. Iran is trying to escalate without inviting full invasion. Whether that balance holds will depend less on intention and more on interpretation. And interpretation, in moments like this, Eddie, can be dangerously subjective. The Strait of Hormuz, the economic detonator. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a narrow stretch of water on a map. It is a pressure valve for the global economy, and right now, that valve is shaking. Roughly 1/5 of the world's oil passes through that corridor. Not 5%, not a symbolic share, 20%. That means when Iran signals that the strait could be restricted, slowed, harassed, or informally blockaded, the shockwave hits markets before a single tanker is physically stopped. Energy markets trade on expectation. If traders believe supply could tighten, prices move instantly. And when oil prices move, everything else follows. This is what economists call a supply-side shock. It is fundamentally different from a demand slowdown. In a demand contraction, central banks can stimulate growth. In a supply shock, options narrow. If oil spikes because of geopolitical risk, the Federal Reserve cannot drill wells or reopen sea lanes. It can only tighten monetary policy to contain inflation, which slows growth and pressures employment. We have seen this movie before. The 1973 oil embargo reshaped the American economy for a decade. The 1979 Iranian Revolution triggered stagflation. Energy is not just a commodity, it is the foundation of industrial civilization. Now imagine the mechanics. Tanker captains hesitate, marine insurance premiums surge. Some insurers temporarily withdraw coverage in high-risk waters. Shipping companies reroute vessels around longer, more expensive paths. Each detour increases cost per barrel. Airlines hedge fuel exposure aggressively. Futures markets spike on volatility. Then the transmission hits home, crude rises, gasoline follows. Diesel costs climb, and that affects trucking. Trucking affects groceries. Agricultural producers face higher fertilizer and fuel input prices. Manufacturing margins shrink. See, small businesses with thin operating buffers feel it first. Consumer sentiment weakens next. And here's the part Washington often underestimates. Inflation psychology moves faster than official data. If Americans expect gas prices to surge, they change spending behavior immediately. Discretionary purchases decline. Savings rates shift. Political anxiety rises. For President Donald Trump, this is not abstract. Economic stability was central to his political brand. Markets respond not just to battlefield outcomes, but to perceived durability of supply chains. If the Strait of Hormuz remains unstable for weeks rather than days, inflation expectations could harden. Iran understands this leverage. It does not need to permanently close the strait to create disruption. It only needs to introduce credible uncertainty. Even partial interference amplifies cost curves globally. The real risk is duration. A brief spike is manageable. A prolonged maritime standoff reshapes budget forecasts, corporate earnings projections, and Federal Reserve calculations. And here is the structural truth. Energy choke points are geopolitical leverage points. When conflict intersects with supply corridors, military strategy becomes economic warfare. The Strait of Hormuz is not the battlefield in the traditional sense, but it may be the detonator. If that corridor destabilizes, the conflict stops being regional. It becomes systemic. And systemic shocks rarely stay contained. The legal question: war without Congress? War without Congress is not just a legal technicality. It is a structural fault line in American democracy. The United States Constitution is not vague about this. Congress declares war. The president commands the military. That balance was intentional. The framers feared concentrated war-making power because war reshapes economies, civil liberties, and global standing. No, it expands executive authority by design. That is precisely why it was meant to be shared. When military force is used without explicit congressional authorization, the legal justification often rests on executive interpretation, commander-in-chief authority, self-defense doctrine, or prior authorizations stretched to fit new circumstances. The War Powers Resolution of 1973 was supposed to restore equilibrium after Vietnam. It requires notification, it sets time limits, but in practice, it has become more guideline than guardrail. In the current crisis involving Iran, the absence of a fresh congressional mandate matters. Not because the United States lacks military capacity, it matters because legitimacy is strategic capital. Wars sustained without legislative backing gradually erode public trust. Vietnam began with limited advisory commitments. Iraq in 2003 began with overwhelming authorization, but later suffered credibility collapse when intelligence narratives fractured. In both cases, domestic confidence became the limiting factor. President Donald Trump faces a choice that extends beyond the battlefield. If military operations expand in duration or scope without congressional approval, political polarization deepens. Markets respond to polarization. Investors do not fear democracy, they fear instability. Legislative battles over war powers introduce fiscal uncertainty, budget disputes, and electoral volatility. There is also the international dimension. Once the United States positions itself as a defender of rules-based order, when military force is used without a United Nations Security Council mandate, critics, including Russia and China, leverage that narrative. They frame it as selective legality. Whether one agrees with that framing is secondary. What matters is that global audiences hear it. Legitimacy is not abstract morality, it is alliance glue. NATO cohesion depends on shared legal and political frameworks. If allies perceive ambiguity, support becomes cautious. Insurance markets, trade agreements, and energy contracts all price in geopolitical predictability. Here is the core structural issue: executive speed versus legislative consent. Modern conflicts move quickly. Presidents argue that immediate action is necessary. Congress deliberates more slowly. But bypassing deliberation trades speed for sustainability. If American casualties increase and operations widen without congressional authorization, political pressure will intensify. Public hearings, legal challenges, campaign rhetoric. Financial markets will interpret that as risk. War requires more than missiles, drones, and carrier strike groups. It requires consent, informed, explicit, durable consent. The real danger is not simply military overreach, it is constitutional drift. When drift becomes precedent, future conflicts become easier to enter and harder to contain. In moments like this, power must be anchored in process. When otherwise, strategic strength erodes from within, and erosion, once begun, rarely stops at the water's edge. Britain's calculated entry, defensive or co-belligerent. When the United Kingdom stepped in, it did not do so with dramatic speeches or troop deployments. It moved through legal language. Prime Minister Keir Starmer authorized the United States to use British military facilities under the doctrine of collective self-defense, invoking Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. On paper, this is a defensive posture. In practice, it sits in a strategic gray zone. There is a difference between intercepting incoming threats and enabling offensive strikes from your territory. The distinction may seem technical. In geopolitics, it is not. If U.S. aircraft launch operations against Iranian missile infrastructure from British-controlled bases, Iran will not parse the legal nuance. It will interpret the United Kingdom as operationally aligned. That perception alone alters the risk landscape. This is where the concept of co-belligerency emerges. International law does not require a formal declaration for a state to be treated as a participant in hostilities. Sustained logistical facilitation can shift classification. Once that threshold is crossed in the eyes of an adversary, assets become legitimate targets. The reported drone strike near RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus underscores this danger. Even limited damage signals a shift. A base that once functioned as a regional hub becomes a node in an active conflict network. For Starmer, the decision is structurally complex. The United Kingdom's special relationship with the United States is not rhetorical. Intelligence integration, nuclear deterrence cooperation, and NATO commitments are deeply institutionalized. Refusing U.S. requests would signal fracture within Western alliance cohesion. Granting access signals solidarity. But solidarity carries cost. Domestically, British politics are already divided. Elements within Labour question the legality of American operations. Opposition voices demand stronger alignment with Washington. The Prime Minister must navigate legal prudence, alliance credibility, and domestic opinion simultaneously. From a financial perspective, escalation risk to British territory affects more than defense planning. Insurance markets assess geographic exposure. Foreign investment evaluates political stability. London's financial sector thrives on predictability. Military ambiguity reduces predictability. NATO cohesion also hangs in balance. If the United Kingdom is perceived as moving from defensive support to active operational participation, alliance dynamics adjust. Other member states must decide their posture. Escalation pressure diffuses outward. Iran's calculus is equally important. If British assets are struck again, even symbolically, the United Kingdom faces its own escalation decision. Does it respond directly? Does it defer to Washington? Does it double down or de-escalate? This is how conflicts widen, not through dramatic announcements, but through incremental alignment shifts. Britain's entry is calculated. It seeks to reinforce deterrence while avoiding direct entanglement. But gray zones are unstable spaces. They depend on shared restraint. If that restraint breaks, the distinction between defensive facilitation and co-belligerency will no longer be academic. It will be operational. Russia, China, and the strategic narrative war. Russia and China are not firing missiles in this conflict. They are firing narratives. And in a multipolar world, narrative is power. When Russia described the killing of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei as a cynical murder, it was not speaking to Tehran alone. It was speaking to the global South. It was speaking to Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, regions that watch Western intervention through a historical lens shaped by colonial memory and regime change skepticism. China's response was more restrained, but no less strategic. Beijing warned against escalation and emphasized stability. That language is deliberate. China positions itself as the defender of sovereignty and economic continuity. It rarely engages in overt moral condemnation. Instead, it frames itself as the rational alternative to Western volatility. One, this is not about morality, it is about alignment. The United States and its allies built their post-World War II influence on a rules-based order: sovereignty, territorial integrity, collective security. That framework gave Washington legitimacy when condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It rallied European unity. It justified sanctions. It framed the conflict in moral clarity. Now Moscow and Beijing see opportunity. If Western powers act militarily without a United Nations Security Council mandate, Russia and China amplify that contrast. They argue selective legality. They suggest that rules apply only when convenient. Whether that argument is persuasive in Washington is irrelevant. What matters is how it resonates in Jakarta, Nairobi, Brasilia. Narrative competition shapes capital flows and diplomatic blocs. Energy markets provide a clear example. If Gulf instability increases oil prices, China, as the world's largest energy importer, will maneuver diplomatically to secure discounted supply from sanctioned or isolated producers. Russia benefits when Western cohesion fractures. It deepens energy partnerships outside Western regulatory frameworks. This is structural power politics. Defense contractors in the West may see short-term gains from elevated security spending, but currency markets and sovereign bond markets track geopolitical risk. If emerging economies perceive instability in Western leadership, they diversify partnerships. That weakens long-term American leverage. There is also a strategic timing factor. The global system is already under stress. Supply chains recalibrating after pandemic disruptions, inflation pressures lingering, technological competition accelerating, narrative warfare layered onto kinetic conflict compounds volatility. And President Donald Trump's decisions are therefore evaluated not only by voters in Ohio or Texas, but by policymakers in Beijing and Moscow. If Washington appears divided domestically or legally ambiguous internationally, adversaries exploit that space diplomatically. In the 21st century, wars are not fought solely with weapons. They are fought with messaging, energy contracts, trade routes, and institutional influence. Russia and China understand that credibility erosion in one theater ripples globally. This is the strategic narrative war. It is quieter than missile exchanges, but it may prove just as consequential. Because in a multipolar world, perception shapes power, and power shapes the future balance of the global system. The economic domino effect. From battlefield to Main Street wars do not stay on battlefields. They move through balance sheets. When missiles fly in the Middle East, Americans often assume the impact stops overseas. It does not. It travels through shipping lanes, commodity exchanges, bond markets, and eventually lands in the budgets of families in Ohio, Arizona, and Georgia. The first sign is volatility. Oil futures spike, freight costs climb, airline stocks swing. That volatility is not random. It reflects risk pricing. Markets assign a premium to uncertainty. When the Strait of Hormuz becomes unstable and Israel and Lebanon exchange fire, watch that premium grows. Shipping companies reroute vessels, insurance underwriters reassess exposure, premiums increase. Those increases are not absorbed out of goodwill. They are passed forward through supply chains. This is how the domino effect begins. Higher fuel prices raise transportation costs. Transportation touches everything: groceries, construction materials, consumer electronics. When diesel rises, food distribution becomes more expensive. When aviation fuel rises, ticket prices follow. When plastics production costs rise, packaging costs rise. The effect multiplies across sectors. Small businesses feel it first. Large corporations hedge energy exposure months in advance. A local trucking company does not. A family-owned restaurant cannot lock in bulk fuel contracts. Margin compression hits smaller operators hardest. That translates into hiring freezes, reduced hours, and cautious expansion. Then consumer psychology shifts. When Americans see higher gas prices at the pump, spending behavior changes immediately. Households cut discretionary purchases, retail slows, credit card balances rise, consumer confidence surveys dip. Markets react not only to hard data, but to sentiment indicators. There is a macroeconomic layer that policymakers cannot ignore. If inflation expectations rise again because of energy volatility, the Federal Reserve faces a dilemma. Tighten monetary policy to control inflation and risk slowing growth. Hold steady. Sharpen risk credibility on price stability. That is not theoretical. It is the structural tension of supply-driven inflation. President Donald Trump built significant political capital around economic strength and low inflation expectations. Sustained energy shocks threaten that foundation. Economic stability is not just a domestic issue. It becomes a strategic variable in foreign policy decisions. Financial markets also recalibrate capital allocation. Defense stocks may surge in the short term. Energy producers may benefit temporarily, but broader indices price in geopolitical risk premiums. Pension funds, retirement accounts, and college savings plans reflect that volatility. This is how a regional conflict becomes a household issue. The domino effect does not require catastrophe. It requires persistence. A few weeks of instability can be absorbed. Several months of elevated risk change forecasts, corporate guidance, and fiscal planning. These wars in the 21st century are fought in two arenas: physical terrain and economic systems. The second arena often determines political endurance. The battlefield may be thousands of miles away, but the economic shock waves travel at market speed. And when they arrive, they do not ask for permission. The strategic crossroads, escalation or containment. We are now standing at a strategic crossroads, not the kind marked by dramatic speeches or formal declarations, but the kind defined by pressure, probability, and political discipline. The next 90 days will determine whether this conflict stabilizes or expands. There are only three realistic trajectories. The first is controlled containment. In this scenario, retaliation cycles remain limited. Israel and Lebanon exchange calibrated strikes without full mobilization. Iran signals strength but avoids actions that trigger overwhelming response. The Strait of Hormuz remains tense but operational. Behind the scenes, quiet diplomacy begins, perhaps through Oman, perhaps through indirect European channels. Markets stabilize gradually. Energy prices settle into a risk premium, but not a shock spiral. Containment requires restraint from every actor simultaneously. That is difficult, but not impossible. It demands that President Donald Trump resist political pressure for maximal retaliation while maintaining credible deterrence. It requires Iran's leadership, in the wake of Ayatollah Ali Khamenei's death, to prioritize regime survival over ideological escalation. It requires Israel to calibrate its northern response against Hezbollah carefully. The second trajectory is regional expansion. This begins incrementally. A heavier missile barrage from Hezbollah, a larger strike on a U.S. installation, a significant disruption in the Strait of Hormuz. Each action would force proportional response. Proportional responses stack. Before long, the conflict shifts from episodic exchange to sustained engagement. Once regional expansion takes hold, economic consequences accelerate. Insurance markets withdraw coverage. Energy futures surge beyond manageable levels. NATO coordination becomes operational rather than symbolic. Domestic political debate in Washington sharpens. Congressional authorization becomes unavoidable. Regional expansion is not inevitable. But history shows that once multiple fronts synchronize, a containment becomes exponentially harder. The third trajectory is less visible but equally consequential. Internal Iranian fracture. Leadership transitions create instability. Power centers compete. Revolutionary regimes under pressure sometimes consolidate. Other times they fragment. If internal fissures widen, negotiation windows can appear unexpectedly. But they can also produce unpredictable actors willing to escalate to prove legitimacy. Strategic forecasting is not prophecy. It is probability assessment. Right now, the balance tilts on perception. If Iran believes Washington seeks regime collapse, escalation risk rises. If Washington believes Iran seeks sustained attrition, escalation risk rises. If Israel believes northern deterrence is collapsing, escalation risk rises. Misperception is the accelerant. For the United States, the challenge is layered. Maintain deterrence credibility without drifting into open-ended war. Preserve constitutional legitimacy while responding decisively. Protect economic stability while projecting strength. American power has never rested solely on military force. It rests on institutional balance, alliance cohesion, and economic durability. 3 U.S. service members have already been lost. That fact cannot be reversed. What can be shaped is what comes next. Escalation is easier in the short term. Containment requires discipline. A history will not judge this moment by the intensity of rhetoric. It will judge it by whether leadership chose impulse or structure. At a strategic crossroads, the path forward is rarely obvious, but it is always consequential. 3 American service members lost. Israel and Lebanon exchanging fire again. Iran calibrating retaliation while avoiding full-scale invasion. The Strait of Hormuz trembling under geopolitical pressure. Britain stepping into a legal gray zone. Russia and China shaping the narrative battlefield. Markets recalculating risk in real time. And American families watching gas prices, grocery bills, and retirement accounts move with every headline. This is not just a story about missiles. It is a story about systems. President Donald Trump now operates inside a narrowing strategic corridor. Iran is balancing regime survival with deterrence credibility. Israel is defending its northern frontier against Hezbollah while avoiding overextension. Yet the United Kingdom is walking a tightrope between alliance loyalty and legal caution. Meanwhile, global markets are acting as a silent barometer of fear and expectation. What ties all of this together is structure. Wars do not expand because leaders wake up wanting chaos. They expand when power, perception, economics, and politics collide faster than discipline can contain them. The deeper lesson here is not only geopolitical, it is personal. In moments of pressure, reaction is easy. Escalation is emotional. But long-term stability, whether in nations or in our own lives, comes from disciplined decision-making under stress. When uncertainty rises, the instinct is to move fast. The wiser move is to assess structure. What are the incentives? What are the consequences? What are the second and third order effects? That applies to global leadership. It applies to investing. It applies to career choices. It applies to family decisions. Here's a quick question for you. In moments of high pressure, what creates stronger long-term outcomes? A. Immediate emotional reaction. B. Structured, disciplined response. Comment A or B below. And beyond that, what do you think happens next? Containment or escalation? How should President Donald Trump handle the next phase? Share your thoughts in the comments so everyone can learn from different perspectives. If you value serious, no-spin analysis that connects global events to your real life, subscribe to the channel. Your support keeps this work going, and we have much more ahead.